Hello, everybody. You may remember a few months ago I sat down in the very nice offices of the TT Club with the club's risk management director, Peregrine Storrs-Fox, to talk about fires aboard container ships. Well, a lot has happened since then, and both of us find ourselves in lockdown still. So we're going to talk remotely via the good offices of Zoom today about an issue that the Covid-19 pandemic has created, which is the accumulation of cargo. Peregrine, hello.
Hello. It's good to speak to you.
You too. I did see a few weeks ago you put out the club put out a note about this issue, which is a new thing, really. I assume it's to do with disruption to supply chains caused by the pandemic. Maybe you can explain a little further.
Yeah, I think what we picked up in a number of different areas was that cargo was potentially stopping mid-transit or even getting close to its destination and unable to be delivered, which meant that there was the potential for cargo to be backing up in all sorts of places, particularly ports and terminals where the transshipment or destination ports, an inability to be able to move much further and particularly get to destination. So we highlighted the risk and some of the issues that might arise from that, including issues around security, off-dock storage, the inability to access things at the time that they needed to be accessed. And obviously there are ramifications for all sorts of cargo commodities, whether that's perishables or dangerous goods. And I guess as summer rolls on and we're still in lockdown, then we now face a situation that in some jurisdictions, actually temperatures will get very extreme, and that potentially is an added risk for a terminal where there is already congestion. Maybe things are not stacked in exactly the ideal places. Potentially there are staffing shortages or difficulties in terms of rotations, which may impact the way that cargo is monitored. Indeed, information flows may be disrupted as well. So all sorts of issues that kind of are just sort of coming around this issue. And we also raised subsequently the problem around abandonment of cargo. So that may be to do with the commodity pricing, that sometimes the pricing will have dropped and a trader is keener to look at a new market rather than, and it's cheaper to do that than carry on with the existing commodity that is somewhere in the supply chain, as well as the issue that some traders may be finding business actually has closed for them and they're going into bankruptcy and the cargo is abandoned for that reason. So there are a number of issues that are kind of playing around the accumulation that we've seen in recent weeks.
There seems to be, there's a parallel really with the oil market over the last couple of months, where we saw demand drop off alarmingly and an awful lot of fuel sloshing about with nowhere to go, really, and tankers and even rail cars being repurposed for storage. Is there enough warehouse capacity to hold this material that's coming in and not going anywhere?
There have been some concerns expressed around warehouse capacity and indeed some of the terminal storage capacity. That would appear very varied in different parts of the world. So I don't think there's one story that will fit everyone. But yes, there must be concerns around storage, and certainly historically we have seen warehouses that have contracted to hold more cargo than, or more specific types of cargo than they're able to do, either from a purely practical reason. So I can think of one instance where there was temperature controlled cargo and too much of it for the physical capacity in that warehouse, and that led to deterioration of the cargo inevitably. So there could be those sorts of capacity issues, and that itself leads on to issues around the space for dangerous goods, or indeed whether a particular warehouse that now becomes used potentially doesn't have the right certification regulatory wise, or the qualification training in place for those who are responsible for looking after the facility. So there are a number of issues that could arise from warehouse capacity or use of warehouse or other storage that isn't regularly used.
And of course, the issue of temperature control brings us back to potential problems with polymerizing substances, I imagine, and a number of other dangerous goods that need to be looked after rather more carefully. What can shippers or cargo receivers do about this?
Well, I guess one is to be very clear as to what it is that the risks are. So, as we know from certain litigation, it's very important for the shipper to understand exactly what the risks are in their commodity. And if you are talking polymerizing cargo, quite often there will be temperature control or inhibition that controls the way that cargo can go through the supply chain, but generally that is time sensitive as well. So it isn't just a straightforward matter of saying, well, we load it in February and it will be discharged in April. And of course, today we're now in June. So if you had that sort of scenario, then potentially you're dealing with a cargo that is now beyond its sell-by date and much more hazardous than was originally intended. And it is tends to be the shipper and the consignee who will be most aware of those sorts of risks, and therefore able to alert others in the supply chain as to what might be happening.
And of course, security is a consideration in the dangerous goods chain as well. It's regulated Part 1, Chapter 1.10, I think, if I remember right. Are there measures that cargo owners, cargo interests can take to ensure that they have the correct level of security at the places they're using?
It's kind of probably on the periphery of my understanding, but my understanding is that the number of commodities that are controlled in that sort of way probably are relatively modest, not without significance, obviously, but again, it comes back to an awareness of what the risks are and ensuring that those risks are properly managed, which includes good communication all the way through the supply chain. So the people who may have custody at a particular point of time are actually doing the things that they need to be doing. And if they are having to use other storage facilities, they're either correctly identifying that those storage facilities do have the right level of security, or they're choosing other commodities to go into that storage facility so they can maintain the existing and pre-existing security capability over that particular cargo.
It's interesting because whenever we talk about any problems in the supply chain, we always seem to come back to talking about communication as the best protection. Do you see any sign that this is encouraging the use of digitized information flows as yet?
I do actually see some sort of green shoots of digitization, if you like. There are a variety of stories as to where technology has been brought in fairly rapidly to support operations. And that is, I think, generally good news. Obviously, there is heightened risk in some senses by bringing something in rapidly. Equally, if it's done in a proper fashion, then technology and digitization can definitely assist. What I see mostly, I think, is probably rather further down the line. So it's developments that have been accelerated by the current situation, not necessarily immediately implemented, although certainly there are stories of new technologies being implemented to try to keep on top of what's happening, particularly in the terminal environment, which is positive.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of generality of information through the supply chain, I think, to be honest, that is likely to be further down the line than immediate.
And it seems that the lockdown, obviously, and the impact on end user demand is very variable around the world and from time to time. Does this create additional problems?
Obviously, there's an extensive trade issue out of that. We had this kind of double punch where China closed down and everyone else was carrying on trading, and then everyone else stopped trading and China had opened for business again. So we've got this funny mismatch of where commodities may be, and inevitably that will lead to some things being in a less optimal position, shall we say. And I think one of the concerns around the accumulation of cargo, that things may just be in a place which is less advantageous than it might be. So we've had some incidents historically of things like nitrocellulose, which has been not just abandoned, but has been left in a hot location for too long. So obviously over time dries out and then can be very vulnerable. And similarly, I've heard of instances more recently where in some jurisdictions, for trade reasons, they've restricted imports, which has meant that cargoes such as ethanol may have been held up in the port area, not allowed to be imported and not necessarily able to be exported, so just left in what can be very warm storage areas. So there are those sorts of risks that may well be apparent. Depends obviously in the specifics of those situations, what those risks may be.
Mm-hmm. And have you heard reports of any incidents arising from dangerous goods being badly stored, badly warehoused?
To be honest, no, which is possibly good news at this stage.
So,
I think that the concern that I've always had around particularly things like non-declaration is that it's a ticking time bomb. You don't know actually where something that's been undeclared or misdeclared is likely to give rise to a problem. And obviously, depending where that is, if it's in a container yard or on board a ship, the resultant damage can be quite significant.
Yeah, okay. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about on this?
I think that most of what I was thinking about as being important, we've been able to cover. So yeah, obviously there are issues in some places around space, the ability to segregate cargo effectively, the ability to monitor it, ensure that it is in the optimal position, and that will continue to be the case. And sort of the concern at the back of my head is always around the non-declaration side. That actually, because of information or the importance of information flow, if that information that is flowing is inaccurate or incomplete, the risks are substantially greater. And I guess that's not wholly dissimilar to the situation that gave rise to Tianjin a number of years ago. That there was a storage facility that appears not to have had the right certification, qualification. They weren't segregating things effectively, and that led to quite a significant mishap for the supply chain. And no one really wants that, particularly when responders are already fairly stretched in many places by the pandemic itself.
Yeah, but that's the worst case scenario. We could get another Tianjin.
I guess it is a worst case scenario, yes, because obviously that does significant impact in that locality, but for the wider supply chain as well.
Okay. Well, Peregrine, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your insights, and I hope that next time I see you, we'll be back in Fenchurch Street.
That would be very nice. Continue the conversation.